Okay, so here we have an overview of statutes versus regulation and some of the key differences between the two. So, federal statutes or legislation, they are enacted by our U.S. Congress. Statutes are the primary source of legal authority in the federal system, and they establish really broad policy, rights, responsibilities. And the goal is to create these legal frameworks that are going to guide the nation's operations. They're going to address social issues and grant authority to federal agencies to implement and enforce specific policies. For example, Congress might pass a law addressing public health or transportation or environmental regulations. And we'll take a look in a minute about some examples that will help you really understand this. But this legislation is essential for setting national priorities, creating rights protections that affect the whole country. So again, this is about like a larger framework. It's big, it's broad, and it's a democratic process, right? And it focuses on public participation and its creation. So since laws are created by Congress, these are elected representatives. And so the legislative process is going to reflect really democratic values of accountability and public participation. The Congress people are looking out for their constituents, the people that vote for them. And you're going to see their constituents' wishes, big picture wishes, show up in the legislation. Now, regulation is the next step, right? Regulations are not big, broad policy. Regulations are detailed rules and procedures that are issued by federal agencies to implement and enforce those laws passed by Congress. So they fill in all the little details. The laws passed by Congress are not detailed. They're really big picture. I'll give you an example. So the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act of 1966. And here's a little clip of what it looks like. And you can see it says, Congress hereby declares that the purpose of this act is to reduce traffic accidents and deaths and injuries to persons resulting from traffic accidents. You may have heard the statistic now that we have 40,000 deaths on the highways every year. Back in the 60s, with a much smaller population, we had nearly 100,000 deaths. So this was a big problem. So Congress decided we need to do something and make motor vehicle safer. And so they passed this really big, broad act saying we're going to make roads safer. And you can see that's the kind of the goals right there. Congress determines it's necessary to establish motor vehicle safety standards for motor vehicles and equipment that are involved in interstate commerce. And now, having taken some of these lectures, you understand why they mention interstate commerce in this bill, right? Because they're looking for authority from the Constitution. Congress can only act where they are authorized to act. And so right here, you can see my arrow. They're mentioning interstate commerce to show, hey, this falls under the Interstate Commerce Clause. And so this language is really big and broad. We need motor vehicle safety standards. Period. That's it. There's not a lot of detail there. But you see, there's more to it than just this. But we go down to section 107 down here, and they're specifically given the Secretary of the Department of Transportation authority to do these things, to engage with the public and with private businesses and with other federal departments to, one, plan and develop motor vehicle safety standards, and two, methods for inspecting and testing to determine compliance with those safety standards. So Congress is not saying what the standards should be. They're not directly telling auto manufacturers what they should and shouldn't do. They're broadly saying we want some safety standards for vehicles, and we're authorizing the Secretary of the Department of Transportation to do so. And that's what a statute's going to look like. It's really going to be this big, like saying what the goals are, saying what the policy should be, but it's not going to have a lot of detail. And you'll understand why when you see what the process of passing legislation is like. So for detail, we go to federal regulations. Federal regulations are issued by these different agencies. So for example, the Department of Transportation. And these are going to be the detailed rules and procedures. And unlike Congress, which is filled with elected officials who can just be anybody, anybody that gets voted in, federal agencies are usually have a lot of technical experts who know what they're talking about, who know the technology and know, or the policy or whatever area, and they know exactly how to draft very specific, detailed regulations to implement Congress's big, broad goals that are listed in the legislation. And because of the nature of regulations, you're just going to see a little bit more flexibility. So the legislation is passed. You're going to see it's kind of a difficult to get them passed. And so once it's passed, we don't want to be changing it all the time, right? We don't want to go through that process all the time for every law that's passed. But with regulations, they're a little bit easier to update. So let's take a look at an example of a regulation. So here we have the National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act, which spells out the broad policy goals of making roads safer. The FMVSS is an example of a regulation. The Fair Motor Vehicle Safety Standards that were created by the Department of Transportation, created by NHTSA, which is part of the Department of Transportation, is really specific. Look at this. This is it's hundreds of pages. Each passenger car, blah, 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 for sale, blah, 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 must have a windshield defogging system, which operates either by applying heat to the windshield or by dehumidifying the air inside. Very, very specific. This is not going to be in a law passed by Congress. This is going to be in the regulations. And again, this might need to change over time as new technology comes out. Maybe we don't use heat to the windshield or dehumidifiers. Maybe something better comes out. The FMVSS can be updated a lot easier than legislation to incorporate this new technology. So that there is the difference between a law passed by Congress, which is big and broad and is more about goals and policy and framework, versus a regulation, which takes the goals of the law and actually puts them in effect by creating detail as to how the law should be implemented. So now that we understand what is a statute and what are some of their characteristics and what are regulations and some of their characteristics, let's take a look at how these are actually created and passed.